Good afternoon to the House at large. Now, the motion being put before the House today is that this House would allow prisoners to use cell phones and tablet devices while serving their sentences. And with the arguments presented today, we will show you why we, as side proposition, both strongly support this motion and believe that this motion should stand. Now, before we have this debate, we need to understand the context in which we're having this debate. We're having this debate in a time in which the modern employer wants tech-savvy employees, that one of the 21 most desirable traits possessed by a potential employee is that of being able to problem solve using technology, and that we're now living in a time in which experience with technology is now becoming a prerequisite for getting a job. But by the same token, we're also having this debate in the context in which criminals are reoffending due to the lack of opportunities provided to them. Now, when a prisoner is released from prison, they are expected to integrate themselves back into normal life. And by normal life, they have to do such things as finding a place to live and finding a job that will ultimately provide for themselves and or their families. But now, this criminal is also legally obligated to make any of their potential employers aware that they are an ex-convict. And now this potential employer is seeing the crime committed by their potential employee and how much time they did for it, ultimately creating a stigma around this person before they're even given a chance to be fairly judged as any other potential employer would judge a potential employee. Now, we as side proposition understand the concerns and controversy that may come with this motion, that these prisoners may be using these tablet devices and cell phones to perpetrate more crimes outside of prison. And we feel that our policy both perfectly combats these concerns but also addresses them. Because in actuality, this motion is already happening, but is happening illegally, in cases of which gang leaders are getting cell phones smuggled into them so they can give orders to gang members outside of prison, therefore perpetrating more crimes outside of prison. That is flying completely under the judicial system's radar because they have nobody to pin it on, as it may seem. Now, with our policy, we feel that these should be state-funded tablet and cell phone devices because it'll be taking what is already happening and making it legal. And with it being state-funded and provided, this allows for many perks, one of them being, as our policy states, strict supervision, in which guards are actually able to look over the shoulder of a prisoner and monitor what they are doing to make sure that these tablets, devices, and cell phones are being used correctly and not to perpetrate more crimes. And because they are state-funded and state-provided, the state will have full access to these devices and what the prisoners choose to do on these devices. So we as our proposition are giving the state full permission to record phone calls that prisoners make and to essentially go through the search history and check whatever these prisoners have been doing on these devices as a precaution. And if these prisoners are found to be using these devices for criminal activity, more years will be added to their sentence, whichever sentence they may already be serving. And the only burden that side proposition bears today is proving that this policy is beneficial. And this moves me on to my first point of positive matter. And by letting this motion stand, we will greatly lessen the amount of reoffending criminals. Now, as you may not know, 80% of current South African prisoners are reoffenders, meaning that they committed a crime, they were tried, convicted, and incarcerated, and then ultimately released. But then they committed a crime, and the same process of tried, convicted, incarcerated is once again repeated. So 80% of our South African prisoners have gone through the motions over and over again. They are constant faces in our courtrooms and in our judicial system. And ultimately, what side proposition is trying to do with our policy and by supporting this motion is put an end to this vicious cycle of crime. Now, elaborating on the point that I said before, is that there's a stigma now attached to these criminals because of what they may have done in the past, regardless of if they are better people now and they've been rehabilitated or have made positive changes in their lives. There's constantly going to be a stigma attached to them, thereby making everything so much more difficult and different for them. Now imagine that these prisoners have been in prison for 3 to 5 years. Think about that. The world has become so vastly different in 3 to 5 years, and these people were incarcerated, and so they're not aware of these differences. So now ultimately what's happening to them is that they do not possess certain skills to make them an attractive candidate for a job or an attractive candidate for housing because of their history. And so now they can no longer provide for themselves and or their families. And what this does is it makes prison look attractive, because all they did was commit a crime, yet they were given a roof over their head, clothes on their back, food to eat, and a bed to sleep on, all just for committing a crime. And now they're going into the real world trying to do the right thing, and they are still being perpetrated by the people around them, by normal society, because of what they may have done in the past. So now they will go and commit more crimes, because life in prison is seen to be far more easy as life back into the real world. And that's why we as Side Proposition want to implement this policy, because it'll put an end to this vicious cycle of crime. Because the judicial system is only doing their job on one side, in which they try and convict and incarcerate these criminals. But by doing that, they ultimately fulfill their one responsibility of making society safer. But when they release these people and they have no kind of normalcy, or no attempt at normalcy because of the stigma around them, and we lead them to reoffend and to commit more crimes, we are just cancelling out what the judicial system has done before. Because now they may have been a changed person, but because prison becomes so attractive, they ultimately commit more crimes, because they just do not know how to function in the real world and are being ostracized by society because of their past indiscretions. Now, this is incredibly relevant because we live in a country in which our crime rate is 3 times higher than the global average, and the judicial system needs to be fulfilling its job on both sides, making the streets safer by getting rid of criminals, but also making the streets safer by rehabilitating criminals and giving them a fair chance in the real world, in which they're now expected to be integrated into without the necessary skills. If this motion falls, we are sending these criminals back into the real world with no skills that would equip them to lead a normal life, and they will become part of that 80% statistic of current South African prisoners who are reoffenders. And we as Side Proposition do not want that. We want safe streets. We want the judicial system to be fulfilling its purpose in every aspect of the word. And that's why we as Side Proposition strongly believe and strongly support the motion of allowing prisoners to use cell phones and tablet devices while serving their prisoners.